research by African geneticists has given them a peek into how migration has changed DNA and has protected Africans from diseases and viruses. Researchers have identified around 62 previously unreported genes associated with viral immunity, DNA repair and metabolism. Professor Zané Lombard is the principal scientist at the National Health Laboratory Service and joins me now on Monday lunchtime. Professor, good afternoon to you. In layman's terms, break it down. What have you learnt? And in the modern context then, why is this important?
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. This is a really fascinating study. I think we've learned so much. Firstly, because we have looked at population groups across Africa that have never been included in genetic studies before. So what we've learned is a significant amount more about genetic variation that we didn't know before. But we're also starting to piece together puzzle pieces that really inform health information. So as you mentioned, learning more about regions that potentially could be protective to infection, that play a role in metabolism, and also information that gives us more details on migration history and giving us information that are complementary to what we're learning from other fields.
Have you been able to link your research to any specific disease or outbreaks?
So that wasn't the purpose of the study. So that is something that we are following up on and will definitely look at the different regions. At the moment, the information really just gives us an indication that there was most probably some kind of adaptive advantage given by these genetic regions in reaction to an infectious pandemic, etc., in history. But no, we haven't looked specifically at whether it's linked to a specific outbreak.
Professor, is it a stretch to say then, as a result of the early stages of your research, that certain groups within Africa have better immunity than others?
No, I don't think that is the correct interpretation. I don't think that there's a better immunity, but I think it does give us an indication that our genes play a role in the way that we react to different pandemics and to different environmental exposures. So as we learn more about African history and about the pandemics and the other exposures of the environment that the populations of Africa have been exposed to, I think that gives us important clues about what parts of our genomes and what genes are really important, and potentially learning more about adaptation in that way.
Is there one central point in southern Africa that is perhaps the font or the fountain of all of this knowledge?
So I think southern Africa is a really interesting point of view from a genetics perspective, just because there's such a melting pot of population groups here. And we're also home to many of the more ancient population groups, the oldest population groups like the Khoi and the San population in southern Africa. I think there's a lot that we can learn from looking at the diversity of these population groups, especially in southern Africa. And we also haven't really learned much about the southern African population groups, just because that really hasn't been the focus in previous studies.
If you were to extrapolate then, given that we are the continent with the greatest genetic diversity, Professor, what could we learn, or what would you like us to learn?
I think we can learn so much more. I think there's so much diversity here from a genetics perspective that we really just have started scratching the surface. I think we can learn so much more from studying African populations and including African people in genetics research. I think it's also really important to think of the health impact. So as we learn more about health, and as we want to incorporate this genetic information into medicine, for instance, in the field of precision medicine, it's really important that all population groups across the globe are included, especially African individuals.
Could we learn something about COVID-19 as a result of your research?
Again, not directly. That wasn't the focus of our study, but I think one of the positive impacts from this study is that we now have access to a lot of genetic information that can be linked to COVID and can be used in different COVID studies that are looking at things like host genetics and the role that the genome plays in susceptibility or protection to COVID. And I think a lot of the resources also that has been put in place to do this kind of research on the continent is now being used for dual purposes, so for testing, for learning more about the virus, etc. So it's really had a positive impact from that perspective.
Absolutely fascinating. Professor Zané Lombard, Principal Scientist at the National Health Laboratory Service, thank you very much for joining us on Monday lunchtime.